Member for Mico South.
Thank you so much, very much, Mr. Speaker. Again, I have to join my colleague in the statements he made and the sentiment that he expressed. Because, you know, Mr. Speaker, that has been the tale of two Saint Lucias. That has been the tale of two Saint Lucias. So, Mr. Speaker, I find it very disturbing, honestly, Mr. Speaker, that in this House, where there are two opposition members, and in the name of democracy, that the leader of government business, sorry, the Prime Minister, as I now know there's a separation of roles, right? That I take it as a threat. I take it as a threat that we are being challenged not to speak. In the threat that you are going to unveil something not tonight, but maybe reveal it at another point. Mr. Speaker, I stand proud of all that we have accomplished. And the records are there to speak for themselves. And so, Mr. Speaker, let me say that as a former Minister of Finance and confronted with the conditions that were set on the economic fund, it wasn't easy. And I'm sure in your first 100 days you discovered it, and that is why you have found yourself in this House to make the amendment that you want to make. Because it is not cumbersome to say that you cannot use and you should not use the money for recurrent expenditure. There's nothing cumbersome in that. It's deliberate and it's very clear.
It was deliberate, you didn't put that Deputy Speaker.
Excuse me? Mr. Speaker.
Member for Castries Central, the relevance of the comment to what is being debated is absolutely no nexus. So please allow the member from Mico South
Mr.
to
Speaker,
proceed.
everything is always subject to interpretation, exactly what my colleague said. Today, the government has the majority in the House to make whatever amendments they want. And there's nothing that we're going to say that is going to change that in this House. But certainly, what we want to put on record with this amendment is what we think that this amendment is going to do. So here it was, we had the Minister of Health, not too long ago, speaking about not putting a politician at the head of the command center. I believe that's what he said. And you said so as well. And so now you have a board for the economic fund in which Cabinet was providing guidelines on how to approve projects, but giving the authority of approvals to those board members. And now by making this one simple amendment, what you in fact have done is taken away that authority for them, because in E what it means is that any project that Cabinet approves, you can use the monies for. That's in essence what it said. In fact, no, I've read it because, I practiced it. I practiced it. Okay? So the fact is that with that clause in, and also specifically saying you cannot use it for recurrent expenditures, that is what caused the difficulty and caused the government to have to put together solid cases when we went to the economic fund. So where you had the hurricane relief at the CDC buildings, where you had the situation with the farmers, because ideally the way that the fund was designed, Mr. Speaker, was for it to be a sovereign fund. And the reason why the fund could buy bonds or the funds could make investments into government-approved projects. Who approves government projects? Cabinet. Right? And there's a mechanism to do that. And in fact, a government-approved project which is already getting financing is included in our budget process, of which it gets parliamentary approval. So Cabinet has a mechanism of approving those projects. So why would you want to take out recurrent expenditure? Now, if in fact, exactly what my colleague said, that income support was being deemed as a recurrent expenditure, and you wanted to come with a one-off case to help persons with income support, I would support that. But to make a carte blanche amendment, which in fact opens up the Pandora's box to allow Cabinet to make the decisions as to how the monies are going to be used, I think it is a regressive step. Regressive. Mr. Speaker, exactly what my colleague had indicated, that even the members on the opposite side would have to agree with me. In fact, when they were in opposition and this bill came up, they spoke of transparency and accountability. And they said that the first thing that they would have done when they got into government was to have immediately repealed this bill. Here's 100 days has gone by. You're bragging about all the things that you have accomplished. Many of them, I have to add, are things in which the former government had started. So it begs the question, if in fact we had not done many of those things, where would your first 100 days be? They used adjectives, Mr. Speaker: dangerous, frightening, and vulgar. They also asked the question, where's the money? Where's the money gone? They kept coming to the House. One member in particular kept coming to the House, despite all the evidence to show him that in fact how the monies were being spent was already being proved. And he had concerns with that.
Speaker,
and if in fact he has concerns...
Member Vakasi South, what's the point of order?
The member for Miko South is misleading the House. The member for Miko South has never come to this House for approval for the use of CIP funds. And we've said it over and over in this House. And he changed the law to prevent him from having to do so. And if he's going to say in this honorable House what he is saying, he has to prove it. He has never given evidence to this House how he has spent over $150 million from CIP, and I will prove it with a document of the House when I stand to speak. Do not mislead the House. You're no longer Prime Minister.
Member for Miko South.
Mr. Speaker, thank you so very much. I see that the justification for the hypocrisy that we're seeing today is a short memory. Obviously. Because we've been in this House several times. In fact, that there was a to and fro debate where we actually showed the member exactly where in the budget everything had been lined out. And the fact is that all of the expenditure prior to the commencement of the economic fund was done through the budgetary process. And every single project was in there. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, I can stand up here without any fear. If the member has all the documentation, then set a trap for me. Let me speak, and then come and say what you have differently. But I know for a fact, Mr. Speaker, that as the Minister of Finance, that I came to this House on many of occasions and had to walk through step by step to show the same member from Castries South exactly where everything was in the budget. Laid out, identified as CIP funds. And the reason we had to do that is because when the bill was first passed, Mr. Speaker, I want to read it. When the bill was first passed, Mr. Speaker, it had 3 lines dedicated. It had 3 lines dedicated to the economic fund. That there shall be an economic fund. Let me get a few. Absolutely. $33.1. The Saint Lucia National Economic Fund is established. 2. Qualifying investments of cash shall be paid into the Saint Lucia National Economic Fund. The Minister for Finance shall lay before Parliament every financial year for its approval and purposes to which the funds will be allocated. Mr. Speaker, even the attendee, we did.
Members,
It was included
members.
in the budget process. Okay? It was included in the budget process. So, Mr. Speaker, and in fact, what we argued with the member from Cast for Yourself
Members.
was that this was grossly inadequate in order for a fund to be established. So, in essence, what had to be done is a new act form called the Economic Fund, and regulations and procedures put in them. Now, when you make that comparison to what the bill said, so let us go to what the vexing issue is right now. The part that they say is confusing. It says functions of the board. Functions of the board are, 1, A, to advance loans for a government-approved capital project. So we now know what a government-approved capital project is. To provide, B, to provide investment for government-approved capital projects. C, to reduce government debt. D, to purchase government bonds. And E, to provide monies for purposes approved by Cabinet that is not considered recurrent in nature. That was deliberate. Why? Mr. Speaker, when we came into government in 2016, and the former Prime Minister at that point pointed out that something went wrong. What went wrong? What went wrong was that they were spending more money than they had. And what they were doing is borrowing money for recurrent expenditures. Mr. Speaker, the evidence is there. In 2003, we were paying $33 million in interest. By 2016, it was up to $170 million. Why? Because that money was being borrowed. So, and Mr. Speaker, you know, honestly, I believe that once you go on the other side, you suffer from amnesia. I mean, I'm listening to some of the members on the opposite side who said complete opposite things. All of a sudden now they have something else to say. Some of the same members who spent the money and don't want to be held accountable. But those things must be said, because at the end of the day, there were so many mistruths that were told. And you know, Mr. Speaker, there's an old Indian proverb that says, when you talk, I shall listen. And when you do, I shall learn. And that's very much to a song that I always follow, which is, action speaks louder than words. That's the truth. And so we heard one thing during the elections in opposition. And we listened. And now we're seeing actions in a completely opposite direction. On a continual basis, Mr. Speaker. On a continual basis. So, Mr. Speaker, if the members on the opposite side want to proceed with this, it starts bringing other questions. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd have thought in full transparency, a 100-day report, the CEO of CIP, who is a professional, a person with the credentials and is suitably placed to be in that position, and has proven his worth with what he has done in transforming CIP over the last 4 years. And let me read what the CEO is supposed to do. The Chief Executive Officer shall attend all meetings of the board, provide the necessary leadership of the unit, and importantly, monitor the citizenship by investment program to ensure that its independence and integrity is maintained and managed in accordance with international best practice. Let me repeat that again. It says monitor the citizenship by investment program to ensure that its independence and integrity is maintained and managed in accordance with international best practice. I thought the minister would have come to the House and indicated that he has sent him on leave. Why has he been sent on leave? Why? So, Mr. Speaker, I don't understand. So if we're going to be transparent and honest with each other, something as significant, especially if you're going to be hoping that CIP is going to generate all this additional revenue, why would you have sent the CEO on leave? He's been on leave for 2 months, Mr. Speaker. Paid leave. Why? I don't understand, Mr. Speaker. And the fact is that this is being hidden. Isn't that something that you did in the first 100 days? Is that an achievement? But you know, Mr. Speaker, I don't want to go off from where we're going. And it's important that we actually listen to the words. So I took the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, of getting the handset of the debate. And if I may, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member from Cass-Free South said, "My advice to the leader of the opposition is that when the St. Lucia Labour Party becomes the next government, we must repeal this immediately, Mr. Speaker. And I will go through this bill and I will ask questions and I hope can allay my fears at this time." He went on to say that there are some bills that are so important, Mr. Speaker, we should not allow, Mr. Speaker, for those bills to go through all its stages in one sitting. We should allow the citizens of this country to reflect on the provisions of those bills and for us to be able to get some feedback from the wider public after the construction of some of these, of those intent of some of those bills. Mr. Speaker, here we are, 2 bills have come to the House, and on 2 successive bills, we've been asked now to read all the bills through.
Member for Micoud South, perhaps I may interject that it's not the role of the chair to get involved in debates, but both members, the member for Suzel Saltibus and now you, have made the statement responding to a statement I made previously regarding the passage of bills at one sitting. I have sat here, I've listened to both you and the member for Suzel make a statement on the amendment to the bill, which I have read, and the interpretation of the bill that you have given is not consistent with what I'm reading. The member for Suzel said the bill is giving the cabinet the authority. That is not reflected in this. What is reflected in this is simply removing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words. The member for Suzel said the bill gives cabinet the authority to spend the money. The authority under this amendment appears to me to still remain with the CIP board. All that this amendment seems to suggest is the removal of what the leader of not the leader of government business, the Minister of Finance, said was a confusing set of words. And the debate must be structured around the amendment. The debate is being structured around something that is not in the amendment. There is nothing in this amendment that suggests the cabinet is now the authority that decides how to spend the money. So perhaps we can stick to what the bill says. At page 6, it simply says, amendment of section 4, the Economic Fund Act number 18 is amended by deleting the words, quote, that is not considered recurrent in nature. But we are hearing a debate about cabinet now having the authority to decide how the money is spent. That's not what I have before me. Let's stick to what is in the amendment.
So, Mr. Speaker, you and I go way back, and I always respect your opinion, but on this one, I'm going to have to differ with you. And certainly on the explanatory notes, if I may, Mr. Speaker, if I may.
Where on the explanatory notes?
Point 4.
Point 4 said, it didn't say that, to make it clear, that the function. It says a function, which means there is more than one function.
Mr. Speaker, it says in clause 2 of the bill,
Yeah.
section 41E of the Act, functions of the fund, is amended to make it clear that a function of the...
A function, not the function.
It says that a function...
Yes.
A function of the St. Lucia National Economic Fund is to provide monies for a purpose approved by...
No, but member from Micoud South, I don't want to go into a debate with you, but the words "a function" is a clear indication that it is more than one function. If it says the function, that's a different thing.
Mr. Speaker, as a former Minister of Finance, and who had to go through and live with this act, and who went through a very difficult time, Mr. Speaker, okay? Because at a time when people needed income support, at a time when we wanted to be able to do more of a feeding programs, okay? And an attempt was made to use the economic fund for that. So I know the difficulty. And the fact is...
Fully appreciate that, member from Mico South. All I'm saying is that I cannot allow a debate to take place on something that is not before us.
But
That's all I'm saying.
But Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order.
Mr. Speaker.
What is the point of order?
Can you make a ruling so the debate can move forward? I mean, we really need to continue the debate, and I think the leader of the opposition is prolonging an argument which is unnecessary. And as presiding officer, can you rule on the direction and let us proceed with the debate, if you don't mind?
Well, I don't want to take away any of the latitude of the member from Mico South, but I will say to the member from Mico South that, as I said before, both the member for Suzel Saltibus and you are making a point that is not reflected in the amendment before us. So I would wish for the debate to reflect what is before us, which is simply not removing the power of the board to spend, to approve the spending of the money, but simply to remove 5 words, 6 words. That's all the amendment is.
So again, Mr. Speaker, I agree, it's a function. It's one of some functions, but it's a critical function, and that the amendment, as it is worded, is subject to giving it a tremendous amount of latitude. So if we look at the functions, if we may, function A is to advance loans for a government-approved capital project. Function B is to provide investment for government-approved capital projects. All those have to be approved by the government and cabinet. It then goes on to say, to reduce government debt. D, to purchase government bonds. And E, which is the one that we're now talking about, which is being amended, okay, which is another function. That function, in essence, makes everything redundant, because basically that's the bullet one. Once you make the change where it says it's no longer for, it cannot be recurrent in expenditure, and change it to provide monies for the purpose approved by cabinet, once you have that, then any expenditure that cabinet approves, any, now can be spent through the CIP funds.
Doesn't the board still have to approve?
No. The board is going to process it, because what you've in essence said, once cabinet approves it, okay, then it's approved. That's the point I'm making, Mr. Speaker.
No, that's not what this is saying.
Mr. Speaker,
But anyway,
Mr. Speaker,
go ahead.
certainly, Mr. Speaker, as a former Minister of Finance, okay, and actually having to go through and to work through this dilemma with the chairperson and the board members of CIP, I understood why we put that provision there. Because what we did not want to do is what has taken place in other countries, in which the monies from CIP are being used to pay salaries and are being used to burden up and support the government. And what we wanted to do was to have created a sovereign fund. And so it was to make it difficult in order to assign grant funds, but to ensure, because if you look at the list of things that were being said, all of them are investment in nature. Buying a bond. If you buy a government bond, it means it's the ability of transferring money to the government, but the government has to repay the bond back to the fund, so that the capital value of the fund remains intact. If you want to make an investment, that it's an investment, and that in fact it's going to be repaid back to the fund. Once you amend Section E, all of that is nullified, because in essence, the person who becomes now the approver of how the money is going to be spent is cabinet. Now, so Mr. Speaker, the question is, so when we came to the House and adjectives like dangerous, and what were the other ones that were being used? Vulgar, dangerous, frightening, vulgar. And that is with how it was worded. So what would those members, if they were in opposition, have to say now? The same persons that were proclaiming to transparency and accountability. The same persons that want to live in glass houses. There are so many questions that remain, Mr. Speaker, of characters involved in the government, of which the Prime Minister has just decided to bypass. And all of a sudden, that changes are being made, and what we've known in the past is almost that it's been expunged and moved on. But Mr. Speaker, these are the kinds of things that create a dangerous precedent.
The president is reading your father's.
The intention was that the board would have autonomy over the monies and that they would be responsible for approving the projects. I have to say to you, if I was a civil servant and I was placed on that board and Cabinet had the carte blanche to make whatever changes they wanted to do or approve whatever they wanted to, I'm not so sure I would put my name to the documents, because it's still requiring them to put the name to the projects. But the reality is all due diligence that they would be performing are gone out the window, because once Cabinet approves it, Mr. Speaker, it's approved. No, Cabinet had to approve a project. And the board then had to prove the merit of investing in that project. And what it did, it distanced the CIP funds from politicians. We just passed a bill on laundry monitoring, in which we're going to great extents to make sure that there's clarity, transparency, and accountability. We just spoke today about the command center. And here we are. We have forgotten all those things, and on something as important as the economic fund, that we want to just open the floodgates and allow Cabinet carte blanche to be able to do what it wants to do. Mr. Speaker, you're asking us to trust the persons who have just stayed in this house today, one by one, to give us a report on what they've achieved in the first 100 days. And they could not even be truthful in that.
You talk about truthfulness.
You want to talk about coming to this house and boasting about what you've achieved for 100 days? You're telling me that in 100 days, 182 deaths, 7,315 cases. So you're telling me over a 100-day period, on average, 2 people died a day. And over 18 months, Mr. Speaker, in 18 months of managing COVID, there was 88 deaths and 5,290 cases. Less than 0.2% of people dying a day. Not that anybody should die, Mr. Speaker. And what we want to do, we think it's sufficient, and I applaud the member from Castries Southeast in asking for a moment of silence. But don't they deserve more, Mr. Speaker?
Why you want to?
Aren't we going to acknowledge our own failure? And why? Because when members were in opposition, they didn't want to listen. When we said to them that the country was broke, they said that we're exaggerating the situation. When they said that there was no necessity for curfews, but you know, it's amazing, Mr. Speaker, the whole hypocrisy on the curfew. So you're telling me that the argument about removing the state of emergency had to do about the Constitution. The issue in terms of a curfew and imposing a curfew, right, is crazy. The Prime Minister from Trinidad and Tobago said it himself.
Member of Microsoft, can we stick to the bill which is before us?
Mr. Speaker, I am bringing in the fact that you're asking us to trust Cabinet. I'm bringing in issues that questions our faith in the individuals who are currently in Cabinet. Because those individuals, through their actions, are showing us that we must question whether we can trust them to manage the sovereign fund. And I think it would be wise that if they would agree to withdraw this, or to agree to allow it to go through only its first stage, and to come back and go in through consultation and clarify whether in fact I am correct on the interpretation, or whether in fact you are correct, Mr. Speaker. But I would say to you, I would strongly suggest that I am right. Because if one of the functions of the board is to approve any project that's approved by Cabinet, it's clear. There's no proviso. There's nothing that's preventing, there's no wall. In essence, the board becomes cabinet. And is that really what we wanted? That's what we've tried to avoid from day one. Those are some of the same mistakes, Mr. Speaker, that we've seen in other countries. And those are some of the things that we're trying to avoid here today. And I would hope that some of the individuals who speak about patriotism would again find their voice on this cause. Okay? So, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, while members of the government Mr. Speaker, again, Mr. Speaker, it's amazing to me, Mr. Speaker, how individuals can suffer in silence for 5 years, go on a TV show, proclaim all is well, and then the day after, all of a sudden, find their voice. And want somehow, Mr. Speaker, to exonerate themselves from the actions of the 5 years. Amazing to me. And I always knew that Houdini was good, Mr. Speaker, but I'm going to see what's going to happen. So, Mr. Speaker, while members on the opposite side, Mr. Speaker, have done what it takes to have won the election, and your voices actually today represent the majority, and they do, and I accept that. If your actions are not just and do not reflect the best intentions for the people which you say that you uphold, ultimately, the most important parliament will be that of the people. The mandate in this House is very clear, 15-2. But the People's Parliament, you only have gotten the support of 20% of the eligible voters. Please take this advice to rule this country with a conscience and to know that 63% of the voting population either did not vote for you or did not vote. These citizens listened to what you said in opposition and are now learning through your actions what the truth was, which so far has been contrary to what you represented in order to win the election. Promises, Mr. Speaker, promises are only words. Action speaks much louder than words. We're all watching your actions. I do not believe that people will sit idly by forever and watch you undermine this country and our democracy. So be careful how you carry the mantle of power, because the hopes and the dreams of many are attached to it. I'm not threatened, Mr. Speaker. I'm not threatened at all. Mr. Speaker, I am here representing the people of Micoud South and representing the 38,000 people that voted for United South Party. And I'm also in hopes to represent the many people who were so confused by all the tall tales that were told during the election that they chose not to vote. The fact is, it is a sad indictment on Saint Lucia, Mr. Speaker, that only 51% of the voting population actually voted, Mr. Speaker. And that is something that we have to address. And as politicians, we share that responsibility as to what we are doing not to encourage and gain the confidence of the voting population of Saint Lucia. So, Mr. Speaker, do not believe that people will not awaken. And all I can ask of the House, Mr. Speaker, and particularly the Prime Minister, is that please do not proceed with this amendment. Please make sure that there are clear barriers preventing Cabinet to even be accused of managing this sovereign fund and this economic fund, and to do the right thing. But if you don't, as was indicated by my colleague, that is your privilege. That is the right that you've earned in the elections. And it's one we respect, but it is one that we are going to keep a very close eye on to see what happens moving forward. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.